The city was full of shining lights, tall buildings, and fast cars. But inside one grand mansion lived a man who, despite all his wealth, carried a deep sadness in his heart. He was a millionaire businessman, respected by many and envied by more. His name was Richard Hale, and he had everything that money could buy. Expensive cars stood in his garage, priceless paintings hung on his walls, and every corner of his house spoke of power and success. But there was one thing his fortune could not fix. His twin children, Ethan and Emma, had been born with a mysterious condition. From the very first day, the doctors said they were blind. They told Richard that the children would never see the world around them, never see his face, never see the beautiful things he worked so hard to give them. The words cut through his heart like a knife. The twins were gentle souls. They often sat quietly in their nursery. Holding each other's hands, they could not see the toys that were placed before them, but they felt them with tiny fingers. They listened carefully to every sound in the house, to the footsteps of the maids, to the ticking of the clock, and to the voice of their father. But Richard, no matter how much he loved them, felt powerless. He would often watch them from a distance. His chest heavy with pain, doctors came and went. Specialists from different countries examined the children. They tried medicines, they tried therapies, but the results were always the same. Nothing changed. Ethan and Emma still lived in darkness. Richard's heart turned colder with every failed attempt. He had power over companies, stocks, and business empires, but he had no power over his children's fate. The mansion was filled with staff. Maids cleaned the floors until they shined. Chefs prepared the richest meals. Guards stood at the gates. But despite all this activity, the house was not a home. It was cold, silent, and heavy with sorrow. The children's laughter was missing. Richard's smile was missing. Life felt like a long winter that never ended. Sometimes Richard would sit in his study late at night, staring at the family portrait above the fireplace. His late wife, who had passed away shortly after giving birth to the twins, smiled brightly in that picture. Her absence only deepened his loneliness. He wondered what she would have done if she were alive. Would she have accepted the doctor's words, or would she have fought harder for the children? The thought haunted him. The twins' birthdays came and went without much celebration. They could not blow out candles or see the gifts they received. The parties felt hollow. Staff clapped politely, but the house never felt alive. The children were growing, yet their world remained locked in darkness. One autumn morning, Richard stood by the large window in his study, looking out at the golden leaves falling from the trees. He wondered if his children would ever see such beauty. That thought broke him again. He clenched his fists, angry at life, angry at destiny. He could buy the most expensive diamond, but he could not buy sight for his children. The staff, though loyal, treated the twins with quiet pity. They served them, fed them, and clothed them, but they never believed in them. To them, the children were fragile beings to be cared for, not souls to be guided. Richard noticed this, but said nothing. His silence was heavy. Yet deep inside, Richard still carried a small spark of hope. Perhaps one day, something would change. Perhaps one person would walk into his house and bring light where there was only darkness. He did not know it yet, but that day was closer than he thought, because soon a new maid would arrive at the mansion, and with her would come the beginning of a miracle. The morning was quiet when the mansion gates opened to welcome a new worker. She was a woman named Grace, tall, graceful, and with eyes that carried both strength and kindness. Her clothes were simple, her shoes were worn, and she walked with the calm dignity of someone who had seen hardships but refused to be broken. Grace had come from a small town far from the city lights. She had lived a life of struggle, working in different homes to support her family. Her heart was shaped by patience, her hands by hard work, and her spirit by faith. When she stepped into Richard Hale's mansion, she felt the weight of sadness that hung in the air. She could almost taste the silence, heavy and cold. Richard met her briefly in his study. He hardly looked at her, his mind elsewhere. To him, she was just another maid, another worker who would come and go. He gave instructions in a sharp voice, explaining her duties, cleaning, cooking, helping with the twins when needed. Grace nodded quietly. She did not argue. She did not ask questions, but her eyes revealed that she was not just there to serve. She was there to give. The first time Grace saw Ethan and Emma, her heart melted. The twins sat together on a large rug, their hands exploring the shapes of wooden blocks. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring into emptiness. To many they looked helpless, but to Grace they looked curious. She noticed how their fingers moved carefully over the blocks, how their heads turned at every sound. There was something in them that no one else seemed to notice, a spark waiting to be lit. Unlike the other staff, Grace did not rush when she approached the twins. She knelt down slowly, introduced herself softly, and let them touch her hands. "I'm Grace," she whispered gently. Her voice was warm. Ethan squeezed her fingers. Emma tilted her head, as if she could sense the kindness in her tone. That small connection filled Grace's heart with hope. Days passed, and Grace's presence began to change the rhythm of the mansion. She sang while she worked, her voice soft and soothing. The children listened, their faces turning toward the sound. She spent more time with them than her duties required. She guided their hands to different objects, letting them feel textures, shapes, and warmth. She clapped gently when they responded, encouraging them as if they could truly see. The other staff whispered among themselves. They thought Grace was wasting her time. Some laughed quietly, saying the children were blind, and nothing could change that. "She is foolish," one maid muttered, but Grace ignored them. She had seen enough of life to know that miracles often came in silence. One evening, Richard walked past the nursery and stopped. He saw Grace sitting on the floor with the twins. She was teaching them through sounds and touch, tapping a spoon on a table, letting them guess the direction of the noise. Ethan clapped his little hands when he got it right. Emma laughed softly for the first time in months. Richard froze. He had not heard that laughter in so long. It pierced his heart. He wanted to believe, but he was afraid. Every time he had hoped in the past, disappointment had crushed him harder. He shook his head and walked away, telling himself it meant nothing. But deep inside, he could not deny the warmth that entered his heart at the sound of Emma's laughter. Grace continued with her quiet mission. She read stories to them even though they could not see the pictures. She described the world outside, the blue sky, the tall trees, the golden sun. Her words painted colors in their minds. Ethan and Emma listened carefully, as if their souls could see what their eyes could not. The staff grew uneasy. Some feared Richard would blame them if Grace failed. Others simply did not like how different she was. But Grace did not stop. She believed the twins had been misjudged. She believed that their blindness was not total darkness, and that with patience and love, something might change. Late at night, when the mansion was silent, Grace often sat by the children's beds. She whispered prayers, asking for strength. Asking for light to reach them, she held their little hands until they slept peacefully. In her heart, she knew her journey in this house was more than a job. It was a calling, and slowly, without anyone fully noticing yet, a miracle was beginning to grow. The twins were responding in ways they never had before. The staff dismissed it, Richard denied it, but Grace felt it. She felt the walls of darkness slowly breaking, one soft beam of light at a time. The days in the mansion began to shift in small but powerful ways. It was not the kind of change that happened with loud announcements or sudden miracles. It was quiet, delicate, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a dark sky. Grace spent more time with Ethan and Emma. She treated them not as fragile children who could do nothing, but as young souls ready to discover the world. While others carried them from place to place, Grace encouraged them to walk slowly, holding their hands, guiding their steps. Their tiny feet touched the cold marble floors, and she praised them with gentle claps. "Good, very good," she would say, and their faces lit up as if her words were sunlight. One morning, Grace placed a ball between Ethan and Emma. She rolled it softly across the rug. At first, their hands reached out blindly, touching only the air, but then Ethan's head tilted, his ears following the sound of the rolling ball. His little hand stretched, brushed against the toy, and caught it. Grace's heart jumped. She clapped loudly, cheering him on. Emma, hearing the excitement, laughed and clapped too. It was a small act, but to Grace it meant everything. Ethan had responded, not just with his ears, but as though he sensed movement, as though some part of him had seen the ball. Grace told herself this was not just chance. This was progress. She began creating new games. She tied little bells to toys, letting the twins chase the sound. She brought bright cloths into the nursery, holding them against the window so sunlight glowed through the fabric. She noticed that Emma turned her face toward the light, blinking quickly as if trying to understand the difference between shadow and glow. Grace whispered softly, "You see more than they believe." "My dear," and her eyes filled with tears. The staff, however, remained doubtful. One of the older maids shook her head. "They are blind. Stop giving them hope," she said. Grace simply smiled. She had no time for negativity. She saw what no one else saw, and that was enough for her. Richard, meanwhile, kept his distance. He was buried in business meetings, phone calls, and financial reports. But late at night, when he returned from his office, he sometimes paused outside the nursery. From the doorway, he could hear laughter, claps, and soft voices. The sound unsettled him. For so long, his home had been silent, heavy with sorrow. Now there was life, and he did not know how to feel about it. One evening, Grace sat with the twins near the window. The sun was setting, casting orange light into the room. She noticed Emma blinking rapidly, her tiny fingers pointing toward the light. Grace leaned close. "Emma, do you see it?" she whispered. Emma giggled, turning her head toward the fading glow. Ethan, too, tilted his head, his eyes moving though unfocused. Grace held her breath. She knew something was awakening in them. She decided to test gently. She held up a red cloth, waving it slowly in front of Ethan. His eyes followed just for a second before drifting away. Grace's heart raced. She wanted to scream in joy, but she stayed calm. Instead, she whispered, "Yes, my boy, you can," and kissed his forehead. Her methods were not written in any medical book. They came from patience, love, and her belief that blindness was not always total darkness. She believed that the twins had been trapped in silence by the words of doctors, and all they needed was someone to guide them toward light. The other staff began to notice. Some whispered behind Grace's back. "The children are different when she's around," one guard told another. "I heard them laughing again today. For years, the mansion had been filled with only silence, and now whispers of life moved through the halls." Richard could no longer ignore it. One night, he entered the nursery without announcing himself. Grace was playing with the twins, guiding their hands over picture books, describing every detail in simple words. "This is a tree," she said, "tall and green, with leaves that dance in the wind." Emma touched the page, smiling as if she could see the tree in her mind. Richard's throat tightened. For the first time, he wanted to believe, but belief was dangerous for him. He had been disappointed too many times. He cleared his throat, startling them. Grace looked up politely. "Mr. Hale," she said softly. Richard's voice was firm. "Do not give them false hope." Grace met his eyes calmly. "Hope is not false when it brings life back to their hearts," she replied. Her words lingered in the air long after he left. That night, Richard sat in his study, staring at his late wife's portrait. His heart battled between doubt and the quiet voice that whispered maybe, just maybe, something was changing, and indeed it was. The twins were no longer silent children living in shadows. Their laughter returned, their hands reached, their eyes flickered toward the light. Step by step, moment by moment, their world was shifting, and all because one woman refused to accept what others believed. The mansion was no longer the silent palace it once had been. Laughter and claps now echoed from the nursery, and the staff could not deny that something unusual was happening. Yet instead of joy, many of them felt uneasy. They had grown comfortable with the idea that the twins were blind forever. For them, it was easier to care for children who expected nothing. Grace was changing that, and change frightened them. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, was the first to complain. She had served Richard for years and carried herself with authority. One afternoon, she watched Grace tying small bells to ribbons and encouraging the twins to chase the sound. "This is nonsense," Mrs. Whitmore muttered. "You are filling their heads with dreams that will break them." Grace looked up, calm as always. "Dreams do not break children," she said softly. "They build them." Mrs. Whitmore shook her head. Convinced Grace was a troublemaker, whispers spread quickly through the staff. Some believed Grace was only pretending to help, so that Richard would favor her. Others thought she was disrespecting the doctors, who had already given their verdict. "Blind," they said. "The children are blind and nothing will change it." But Grace ignored the whispers. She focused only on Ethan, and Richard, meanwhile, felt torn. On one hand, he saw no real proof. The children still stumbled, still stared blankly much of the time. Yet he could not ignore the small signs. The way Ethan tilted his head toward light, the way Emma's eyes followed movement for a moment too long to be chance. He wanted to believe. But fear chained his heart. One evening, the conflict reached him directly. Mrs. Whitmore knocked on his study door. Her voice was sharp as she spoke. "Sir, this new maid is filling the children with false hope." Richard set down his pen. "Tired from business matters? Explain," he demanded. Mrs. Whitmore folded her arms. "She plays games. She talks as if they can see. She claims they are improving. It is not healthy. They will suffer more when they realize nothing has changed." Richard rubbed his temples. He was a man of facts, of numbers and contracts. He did not like uncertainty, but her words reminded him of something. Emma's laughter the other night, Ethan catching the ball by sound. Could those really be meaningless? He dismissed Mrs. Whitmore with a sigh. "Leave her to her duties," he said, though his voice was unsure. That night, Richard found himself wandering toward the nursery again. He stood at the doorway unseen. Grace was sitting on the floor with the twins, a candle placed on the table beside them. She waved her hand slowly in front of the flame. Ethan's eyes flickered. Emma giggled. Reaching a tiny hand toward the light, Grace smiled and whispered, "Yes, you feel it, don't you? The warmth?" The glow. Richard's breath caught. For the first time, he saw something undeniable. His children were responding, not perfectly, but clearly. He stepped forward, startling Grace. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Grace rose to her feet. "I am teaching them to reach for what the world said they could never have," she answered. Richard's face hardened. "The doctors told me there is no cure." Grace's voice did not shake. "Doctors see with science, but mothers see with the heart. They are not fully blind. They have been misjudged." Her words struck him like a hammer. For years he had lived chained by the doctor's words. He wanted to believe her, but fear of disappointment gnawed at him. "Do not give me hope where there is none," he said coldly. And he left. But deep inside, the spark had already been lit. The tension in the house grew heavier. The staff eyed Grace with suspicion. Some refused to help her. Others whispered insults when she passed. Yet Grace never lost her calm. She remembered the twins' laughter, the way they reached for light, and that was enough to keep her strong. The children, too, began to change in ways no one could ignore. Ethan walked a few steps on his own, guided by the sound of Grace's clapping. Emma traced shadows on the wall with her small hands, giggling as if she knew they were alive. These little victories filled the nursery with warmth. But outside the nursery, resistance grew. Mrs. Whitmore whispered to others, "She is dangerous. She is making the master weak with foolish hope." One guard added, "If the children fail again, it will break him worse than before." Fear of disappointment spread like smoke through the mansion. Richard was caught between two worlds, the cold certainty of doctors and staff, and the glowing warmth of his children's laughter. He wanted to protect himself, but every time he heard Emma giggle or Ethan call out, he felt his heart softening. One night, as he sat in his study staring at his wife's portrait, he whispered, "What would you do?" The silence gave him no answer, but the memory of her kind eyes seemed to push him toward hope. Perhaps it was time to stop fearing pain and start believing in love. The conflict in the house had only just begun, but within it, the seeds of transformation were growing stronger, and Grace, though only a maid in the eyes of others, was slowly becoming the one person who could change everything. That's part 4, 800 words complete, with unique scenes of conflict and rising tension. Do you want me to continue with part 5, unique 800 words? Same comma rule, where the first real breakthrough finally happens? The days grew colder as winter approached. The grand mansion seemed even larger under the gray sky. Yet inside the nursery, warmth was returning little by little. Grace had turned the once silent room into a place of songs, laughter, and small victories. Ethan and Emma were changing. Their movements grew stronger, their reactions sharper. Still, most of the staff refused to accept it. They shook their heads and said, "It is only imagination. Nothing more." But Grace knew better. She saw the signs. She felt it in her heart. Something was awakening within the twins. One afternoon, Grace placed a bright red ball on the rug. She rolled it gently across the floor. The sound echoed softly. Ethan turned his head. His eyes flickered. His small hands stretched forward. At first, he missed, touching only the carpet. But then, something happened. He reached again. This time his fingers landed on the moving ball. He held it tight and laughed. Grace froze, her heart pounding. Tears filled her eyes. She clapped her hands joyfully. "You did it, Ethan. You found it." Ethan laughed louder, shaking the ball as if proud of himself. Emma clapped too, not wanting to be left behind. Grace quickly tested again. She rolled the ball in the opposite direction. Ethan followed, his eyes shifting for just a moment. Grace caught it. He was not only hearing the sound, he was sensing the movement, she whispered to herself. "They told me you were blind, but I see the truth now." That evening, she tried another test with Emma. She lit a candle and placed it on the small table. The flame danced gently, casting a golden glow across the room. Emma blinked several times, her little face curious. Slowly, her hand rose toward the light, stopping just a few inches away. Grace held her breath. Emma giggled softly, as if she could feel the warmth and see the glow. It was the moment Grace had been waiting for. The breakthrough. The twins were not lost in darkness. They were reaching for light. The next morning, she could not hold her excitement. She wanted Richard to see. She wanted him to believe. She asked the butler to bring him to the nursery. At first, Richard refused, saying he was busy with important work, but when Grace insisted, his curiosity pushed him to follow. Richard stood at the doorway, arms crossed, his face stern. "Show me," he said. His voice cold. Grace nodded. She placed the ball on the rug again. Her hands shook with both fear and hope. She rolled it slowly. Ethan turned his head. His eyes moving slightly, he stretched his hand and caught the ball. His laugh filled the room. Richard's chest tightened. His eyes narrowed. "Do it again," he said. Grace obeyed. She rolled the ball a second time. Ethan reached again and caught it. Richard's lips parted, disbelief flooding his face. His son was not lost in complete darkness. Before he could speak, Grace lit the candle for Emma. "Watch," she whispered. Emma blinked rapidly, her tiny fingers reaching toward the flickering flame. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward quickly, grabbing Emma's hand before it got too close. She giggled at his touch, her eyes still fixed on the golden light. Richard's heart pounded wildly. He sat down heavily on the chair, his hands shaking. For years, he had believed the doctors, believed the staff, believed the sorrow that chained him. And now, before his very eyes, his children were proving everyone wrong. But with joy came anger. Anger at the wasted years. Anger at himself for giving up so easily. He looked at Grace, his voice trembling. "How did you see what no one else did?" Grace lowered her head humbly. "Because I did not see them as blind children. I saw them as children who needed love, patience, and guidance." Richard stared at her for the first time. He felt respect for this maid who had come into his life quietly and turned his world upside down. He whispered to himself, "My children can see," as though saying the words aloud would make them more real. The staff, however, were not pleased. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Grace was tricking the master with clever games. Others feared that, if she succeeded, their own years of care would look meaningless. Mrs. Whitmore in particular grew bitter. She cornered Richard later that evening, saying, "Sir, you are being deceived. These are illusions. The children cannot see. Do not let this maid fill your heart with lies." Richard did not answer her. He was too lost in the memory of Emma's blinking eyes and Ethan's joyful laugh. Deep down, he knew the truth. His children were not fully blind. They had been trapped in shadows, and now the shadows were breaking. That night, Richard could not sleep. He paced in his study, remembering the moment his son caught the ball, the way his daughter reached for the flame for the first time in years. He felt something stronger than sorrow. He felt hope. It scared him, but it also gave him life. The next day, he visited the nursery again, this time without being called. He sat on the floor beside Grace, watching quietly as she worked with the twins. He did not say much, but his presence said everything. For the first time, the children had their father watching, not with pity, but with belief the breakthrough had come, and nothing would ever be the same again. The mansion was no longer the same place it once had been. The cold silence that had ruled for years was now broken by laughter, clapping, and the soft voice of Grace guiding the twins step by step. For Richard, every day brought a new discovery, a new reason to question everything he had believed before. He began spending more time in the nursery. At first, he only stood at the doorway, his arms folded, watching quietly. But soon, he found himself sitting on the floor beside Grace, his expensive suits wrinkled against the rug, his polished shoes forgotten as he leaned closer to watch Ethan and Emma. The man who once kept his distance was now holding toys, rolling balls and even clapping when his children responded. The twins were not cured. They still stumbled. Their eyes still struggled to focus. Yet the difference was undeniable. They were no longer lost in darkness. They were aware, they were responding, and their little faces glowed with joy every time they succeeded. Richard saw it with his own eyes. And each time his heart softened, one morning, Richard called in the family doctor, a man who had given the original diagnosis. The doctor examined the children carefully, shining lights into their eyes, testing their movements. After some time, he looked puzzled. "They respond?" he said slowly. Not like fully sighted children, but certainly not like those in total blindness. Perhaps the condition was misjudged. Richard's hands clenched. Misjudged, the word echoed in his mind like thunder. For years he had lived in despair, trusting the certainty of medical words. And now he realized his children had been left in shadows not only by their condition, but by people who had given up too soon. He turned his gaze toward Grace, standing quietly with her hands folded, and in that moment, respect turned into deep gratitude. But outside the nursery walls, resistance still burned. Mrs. Whitmore could not accept what was happening. She told the other staff, "This is dangerous. The master is losing himself to false hope. This maid will ruin the house." The whispers spread through the halls. Some staff grew jealous, others fearful. They had lived under the belief that the twins were helpless. Now Grace was proving otherwise, and it unsettled them. Richard noticed the tension, but he no longer cared. His children's progress mattered more than their gossip. He instructed the staff to follow Grace's guidance. "If she tells you to assist, you will assist," he ordered firmly. For the first time, Grace's position in the mansion was no longer just that of a maid. She was recognized as someone with authority, someone who carried light where others saw only darkness. Grace, however, remained humble. She never asked for praise, never demanded recognition. She only focused on Ethan and Emma, guiding their hands, describing the colors of the world, teaching them through sound, touch, and gentle patience. Each day she whispered to them about the sun, the trees, the sky, as though painting pictures in their minds. The twins listened with wonder, and slowly their eyes began to follow her voice, as though searching for those unseen images. One evening, Richard sat with Grace in the nursery after the twins had fallen asleep. The candlelight flickered softly, casting shadows across the room. He spoke in a low voice. "Why did you not give up like the others?" Grace smiled gently. "Because I have known darkness myself, and I have learned that even the smallest light can guide someone out." Her words struck him deeply. He realized then that Grace's strength did not come from knowledge alone, but from a life of hardship that had shaped her into someone who could see hope where others saw none. For the first time in many years, Richard felt something he had forgotten. Faith, not faith in science or wealth, but faith in the unseen, in the power of love and patience. The twins continued to grow. Each day they discovered new things. Emma began to reach for objects with more certainty. Ethan laughed when he managed to follow movement with his eyes. Their world was no longer completely dark. It was filled with shapes, shadows, light, and love. The mansion that once stood in silence was now alive with movement and sound. Ethan and Emma no longer sat quietly in corners as they had before. They laughed, they clapped, they reached for toys, and each day their steps grew stronger, their eyes more focused. It was as though life itself had returned to the Hale household. Yet the world outside did not believe. The doctors had declared the children blind since birth, and the staff had whispered that nothing would change. For Richard to claim progress sounded like a dream, but he could not deny what he saw with his own eyes. His children were awakening one morning. Richard called for a gathering in the grand hall. The staff, the family doctor, and a few trusted business associates stood waiting. He wanted everyone to see what Grace had shown him. He wanted no more whispers, no more doubts. Grace entered with the twins. Holding their small hands, the staff looked skeptical. Mrs. Whitmore shook her head with quiet disapproval. The doctor adjusted his glasses, preparing to defend his past judgment. Richard stood tall, his voice firm. Today you will see what I have seen. My children are not lost in darkness. Grace knelt on the carpet with Ethan and Emma. She placed the red ball before them. Her voice was calm and encouraging. Ethan, find the ball, she said gently. She rolled it across the rug. The hall fell silent. Ethan tilted his head. His eyes flickered. He stretched out his hand, missed once, then reached again. His fingers landed firmly on the ball. He laughed and clapped. The sound echoed through the hall like music. Gasps spread across the room. The doctor leaned forward in disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore's lips tightened. Grace then lit a candle and placed it on a small table. Emma, she whispered, do you see the light? Emma blinked rapidly, her tiny fingers reaching toward the flickering flame. She stopped just before touching it, giggling softly. Richard quickly stepped forward, lifting her into his arms. His heart swelled with pride as tears threatened his eyes. The doctor cleared his throat, his voice uneasy. This should not be possible. Perhaps my earlier diagnosis was wrong. They are not fully blind. The words were heavy. Each person in the hall knew what they meant. For years, the twins had been labeled, judged, and left in shadows because of a mistake. Richard turned his gaze toward Grace. His voice broke with emotion. It was not your science that saved them. It was her faith, her patience, her love. Grace bowed her head humbly, but her eyes shone with quiet strength. The staff stood speechless. Some looked ashamed. Remembering how they had doubted her, Mrs. Whitmore opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. The truth was too strong. The turning point had arrived. From that day, everything changed. Richard ordered that Grace would no longer be treated as a mere maid. She is their guide, he declared. You will respect her as you respect me. The staff obeyed, though some still held jealousy in their hearts. Grace began working more openly with the twins. She introduced new exercises. She described colors and shapes, letting them trace outlines with their fingers. She walked with them in the garden, letting them feel the sunlight on their faces and the wind in their hair. Each day, their awareness grew sharper. Their world grew brighter. Visitors came to the mansion, curious about the miracle. They left astonished, speaking of the twins' laughter and the maid who had defied the impossible. Richard's reputation, once shadowed by sorrow, began to shine with hope. Business partners whispered that the Hale family had been touched by something extraordinary. But for Richard, this was not about reputation. It was about being a father again. He no longer hid behind his office walls. He spent evenings playing with his children, reading to them, holding their hands as they walked. For years, he had lived as a man chained by grief. Now he lived as a father reborn. One evening, Richard sat in the garden with Grace while the twins played nearby. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Emma giggled as she reached toward the glowing horizon. Ethan clapped at the sound of birds flying overhead. Richard turned to Grace, his voice soft. You have given me back my children, Grace smiled gently. No, sir. I only showed you what was already inside them. Her words humbled him. For so long, he had trusted money, doctors, and the voices of the powerful. Yet the truth had come from a woman of simple life, a maid with nothing but patience and faith. It was a lesson he would never forget. The turning point had not only changed the twins, it had changed Richard too. He began to see the world differently. He no longer measured worth in wealth, but in love, sacrifice, and faith. The mansion that once stood as a cold palace now shone as a home. Every corner echoed with laughter. Every room held warmth. The staff walked with a new awareness, no longer pitying the children, but respecting them. The moment of truth had come. And with it, the future was rewritten. The twins were no longer symbols of sorrow. They were living proof that even in the deepest shadows, light could be found. And at the center of it all stood Grace, the woman whose quiet strength had changed everything. The Hale mansion no longer carried the weight of sorrow that once filled its halls. The heavy silence that had lingered for years was gone, replaced with the sound of laughter, clapping, and soft voices of children who were discovering life in a new way. Ethan and Emma were not perfect. Their vision was still weak, and they often stumbled or reached in the wrong direction. But they were no longer lost in darkness. They could sense light, follow movement, and even recognize shapes with growing confidence. The shadows that had once chained them were lifting day by day. Richard watched his children with a heart full of pride. He had spent years believing they were destined to live in darkness, but now he knew better. The truth was that they had always carried light within them. They only needed someone to guide them out, that someone had been Grace. Grace continued to teach the twins with the same patience she had shown from the beginning. She brought them into the garden every morning, letting them feel the warmth of the sun, the coolness of the grass, and the colors of flowers. She described everything with simple words, painting pictures in their minds, slowly. The children began to connect words with shapes, sounds with images, and their small world began to grow. The staff, who had once doubted her, now looked at Grace with quiet respect. They had seen with their own eyes what she had achieved, and though some still struggled with pride, they could no longer deny the truth. Mrs. Whitmore, once her greatest critic, had grown silent. She performed her duties without comment, avoiding Grace's steady gaze. Deep inside, she knew she had been wrong. Richard, too, had changed. The man who once drowned himself in business and locked his heart away now lived differently. He no longer spent every evening in his study. Instead, he played with his children, told them stories, and laughed with them until the halls echoed with joy. The empire he had built seemed small compared to the happiness he now found in simple moments. One afternoon, Richard invited close friends and relatives to the mansion. He wanted them to see his children, not as the blind twins they once pitied, but as children who had fought through shadows to find light. The guests arrived expecting sorrow, but left astonished. Ethan followed the movement of a toy car across the floor. Emma pointed at the glow of a candle. The guests whispered in amazement. "It is a miracle." Richard stood before them proudly, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. "This is not a miracle of money or medicine," he said firmly. "It is the miracle of love, patience, and faith." His eyes moved toward Grace, who stood quietly at the back of the room. He added, "And it is the miracle of a woman who never gave up when everyone else did." Grace lowered her head. Embarrassed by the attention, she never sought glory. For her, the joy of seeing the children thrive was enough. Yet Richard knew the truth. Without her, his children would still be lost in shadows. Without her, his home would still be cold. The twins continued to grow. They learned to walk more confidently, to explore the garden, to reach for toys with eager hands. Their laughter filled the halls like music. The mansion, once a prison of sorrow, had become a home of hope. At night, when the children were asleep, Richard sometimes sat with Grace by the fire. They spoke not as master and maid, but as two people who had carried pain and found light. Richard often asked, "Why did you stay when others gave up?" Grace always answered the same way, "Because children should never live in darkness when there is still a chance for light." Her words stayed with him. They reminded him that wealth alone could not save a soul, but love could, in time. Richard began to see Grace not only as a guide for his children, but as the heart of the family. He respected her wisdom, her strength, and her humility. The children adored her, calling her Mama Grace. The title slipped from their lips naturally, and Richard did not stop them. In his heart, he knew she had earned it. The Hale family was no longer the same. They had been broken by sorrow, blinded by despair, and trapped by wrong beliefs. But now they were free. Free to hope, free to laugh, free to live. The story that began with silence and pity ended with light and love. Ethan and Emma were no longer known as the blind twins. They were known as the children who overcame. And at the center of it all was Grace, the woman who walked into their lives quietly and left a mark that would never fade. The future stretched before them like a bright horizon. There would still be challenges, still be struggles, but they would face them together as a family reborn. For Richard, the greatest wealth was no longer in his businesses or treasures. It was in the laughter of his children, in the warmth of Grace's faith, and in the light that had finally entered his home. And so, the mansion that once stood as a silent palace of sorrow became a home of freedom and new beginnings, a place where love had proven stronger than doubt, and where a simple maid had changed everything, forever.